at the height of the Ice Age, between 34,000 and 30,000 BC. Much of the world's water was contained in ice sheets. Bering Sea was hundreds of meters below its current level, and a land bridge some 1,500 kilometers wide, known as BERINGIA, emerged between Asia and North America. The first people to reach North America, after following game in Siberia, did so without knowing that they had crossed into a new continent. Once in Alaska, it would take thousands of years to work their way through what is now known as the United States. By 10,000 BC, when mammoths began to die out, life was already well established in much of the Western Hemisphere. Bison became the main source of food. Cultivation started, and by 300 BC, signs of early village life appeared. Are we there yet? Nope. We'll talk about the Native Americans now. The first tribal groups to build mounds in the United States were called the Adenians, around 600 BC. Hopewellians, found in Ohio, replaced the Adenians, and by around 500 AD, they too were replaced by Temple Mounds culture. They took slaves and practiced human sacrifice, I'll give you that. Their city Cahokia, in Illinois, was one of the first cities in America, and by around 900 AD, Anasazi, the ancestors of modern Hopi tribe, started building stone and adobe pueblos. The America that greeted the first Europeans was, thus, far from an empty wilderness. It is thought that as many people lived in the Western Hemisphere as in Western Europe at the time, about 40 million. It is thought that around 2 to 18 million people lived in US at the onset of European colonization. From the initial contact with the Europeans, diseases, particularly smallpox, ravaged whole communities and brought horrific decline to their population, which contributed more than the numerous wars brought about them. Native American customs and culture were extraordinarily diverse, and their society was closely tied to the land. If you burn everything, there would be no way of knowing that they existed, right? Although they developed certain types of hieroglyphics to preserve certain texts, tribal cultures are primarily oral. Ooh, Vikings! The first Europeans to arrive in America were Norse, traveling west from Greenland, where Eric the Red founded a settlement around 985 AD. In the year 1001, his son Leif explored what is now known as Canada. There are claims that the Viking sailors explored the Atlantic coast as far as the Bahamas. In return for bringing back gold and spices, the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus was promised 10% of the profits and governorship over new-found lands and the title of Admiral of the Ocean. So in his second expedition in 1495, which he got after exaggerating his reports and promises to the Spanish royalty, he launched a raid, capturing 15,000 Arawak men, women, and children. 500 of them were loaded onto ships, but by the time they reached Spain, 200 survived. The bits of gold in the river and a gold mask presented by a local chief heightened his dream of raiding some supposed fields of gold. So he gave the natives an impossible task, collecting gold. If they failed, they would be hunted down and killed. Pay me, peasants! As it became clear that there was no gold to be found to pay back for the dividends to those who had invested in his expedition, he resorted to capturing the natives for slave trade. In less than 2 years, 250,000 Indians died. And by 1650, none of the original Arawak, remarkable for their generous hospitality, were left on the island. John Cabot in 1497, just 5 years after Columbus landed in the Caribbean, arrived in Newfoundland that would later provide the basis for British claims to America. Columbus never saw the mainland United States, but the exploration of the continental US were launched from the Spanish possessions that he helped establish. The first of these took place in 1513, when Juan Ponce de Leon landed on the Florida coast near the city of St. Augustine. Hernando Cortés burned all his boats so his crew members could not attempt to go back to Spain. That's a huge dick move from Cortés. Cortés marched from town to town, killing deliberately, burning towns as he went along. He invited the headmen of Cholula Nation to a square, and when they came, Cortés' small army massacred the unarmed to the last man. They then looted the city and moved on. Just like that. They succeeded in defeating the Aztec Empire and conquered Mexico in 1522. The name America was derived from the Italian Amerigo Vespucci. By 1529, reliable maps of the Atlantic coastline had been drawn up. One of the most significant early Spanish explorations was that of Hernando Soto and Francisco Pizarro during the conquest of Peru. Soto reached as far as the Mississippi River in search of riches. Coronado in 1540, in search of the mythical 7 cities of Cibola, took him to the Grand Canyon, but he never got his golds. They left enough horses to transform life on the Great Plains. Horses actually lived there before this, but it is believed that they were extinct by that time and were reintroduced. An interesting theory. The northern part of the US was slowly revealed by men such as Giovanni de Verrazzano in 1524. A decade later, the Frenchman Jacques Cartier sailed towards St. Lawrence River and laid the foundations for the French claim to North America. Pedro Menendez would later establish the first permanent European settlement at St. Augustine in what would become the United States. And then came the English. The great wealth of the Spanish colonies provoked the English to send out expeditions, drawn in parts by Francis Drake to conduct successful raids on Spanish treasure ships. Finally, in 1585, Walter Raleigh established the first British colony in North America on Roanoke Island. It was later abandoned, and a second effort 2 years later would also prove a failure. It would be 20 years later when the British would try again at Jamestown in 1607, and this time, North America would enter a new era. So who are the immigrants? What's that now? Starting from the early 1600s and spanning for more than 3 centuries, immigration from Europe to America grew from a trickle of 100 English colonists to a flood of millions of newcomers, impelled by powerful and diverse motivations. Immigrants came in small, overcrowded ships, in a 6 to 12-week voyage on meager rations. Many died of diseases, and ships were often lost to the tempest-tossed seas. Most of them left their homelands to escape political oppression, to seek freedom to practice their religion, or for adventure and opportunities denied at home. The early settlers might not have survived had it not been for the help of friendly local tribes who taught them how to grow native plants like pumpkin, squash, beans, and corn. The eastern seaboard extending nearly 2,000 kilometers provide them rich sources of game and raw materials to build houses, ships, and cargoes for export. Although the new continent was remarkably endowed by nature, trade with Europe was vital for articles the settlers could not provide. Political considerations also influenced many people to move to America. In the 1630s, arbitrary rule by England's Charles I gave impetus to the migration to the New World. The coming of colonists in the 17th century entailed careful planning and management, as well as considerable expense and risk. They were going 5,000 kilometers across the sea, some of them for the first time. The first of the British colonies to take hold in North America was Jamestown. A group of about 100 men set out for the Chesapeake Bay in 1607. Seeking to avoid conflict with the Spanish, they chose a site about 60 kilometers up the James River from the bay. The men were more interested in finding gold than farming. John Smith emerged as the dominant figure among them. He returned to England in 1609, and in his absence the colony descended into anarchy. Only 60 of the original 300 settlers survived by May 1610. Prosperity did not come quickly. In 1612, John Rolfe began crossbreeding imported tobacco seed from the West Indies with the native plants and produced a new variety that was pleasing to the European taste. Within a decade, it had become Virginia's chief source of revenue. Between 1607 and 1624, approximately 14,000 people migrated to the colony, yet only about 1,100 people were living there in 1624. Are you bored yet? Wait until you hear this. Religion! During the religious upheavals of the 16th century, a group of men and women called Puritans sought to reform the established Church of England and wanted to replace Roman Catholicism with simpler Protestant forms of faith and worship. Their reformist ideas threatened to divide the people and undermine royal authority. In 1607, a small group of separatists departed for Leyden, Holland, where the Dutch granted them asylum. They were dissatisfied with the discrimination there, and in 1620 they secured a land patent from the Virginia Company. A group of 101 men, women, and children set out for Virginia on the board of the Mayflower. They landed on Cape Cod in New England instead. the men drafted a formal agreement to abide by just and equal laws. This was the Mayflower Compact. In December, Mayflower reached Plymouth Harbor, and they began to build settlement. Half of them died of diseases. Another new wave of immigrants arrived on the shores of Massachusetts Bay in 1630, bearing a grant from King Charles to establish a colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was to later play a significant role in the development of the entire New England region. The rigid orthodoxy of Puritan rule was, however, not to everyone's liking. A young clergyman, Roger Williams, objected to the colony's seizure of native lands. Banished from Massachusetts Bay, he purchased land from the Narragansett tribe in what is now Providence, Rhode Island, in 1636. There he set up the first American colony, where the complete separation of church and state, as well as freedom of religion, was practiced. Orthodox Puritans soon began leaving Massachusetts, and by 1630s, many were ready to brave the danger of native attacks to obtain level ground and deep, rich soil. Hired by Dutch East India Company, Henry Hudson in 1609 explored the area around what is now known as New York City. The first interest of the Dutch in the area was the fur trade, and the Dutch established close relations with the Five Nations of the Iroquois. Settlement of the island of Manhattan began in the early 1620s. In 1624, the island was purchased from local Indians for the reported price of $24. It was promptly named New Amsterdam. In 1632, the Calvert family obtained a charter for the land north of the Potomac River in what was to become known as Maryland, and its first town, St. Mary's, was established in 1634. In order to attract settlers and make profit from their holdings, the Calvert family had to offer people farms. The number of independent farms grew in consequence, and owners formed their first legislature in 1635. By 1640, the British had solid colonies established along the New England coasts and Chesapeake Bay. To the west there were the original Americans, the native tribes. Sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, the eastern tribes were no longer strangers to the Europeans. And although Native Americans benefited from access to new technology and trade, the disease and thirst for land from the early settlers posed a serious challenge to the natives' long-established way of life. European settlers brought knives, axes, weapons, utensils, fishhooks, etc. And those natives that traded initially with the Europeans had significant advantage over rivals who did not. Attention was also put into the fur trade. Early colonial tribal relations were an uneasy mix of cooperation and conflict. The first of the important native uprisings occurred in Virginia in 1622, where some 347 settlers were killed. Picot War followed in 1637 as local tribes tried to prevent settlement of the Connecticut River region. Almost 5,000 kilometers to the west, the Pueblo tribes rose up against the Spanish missionaries 5 years later in New Mexico. The steady influx of settlers disrupted tribal life. More and more game was killed off, and tribes were faced with the difficult choice of going hungry or going to war and moving and coming into conflict with other tribes in the west. The Iroquois were more successful in resisting European advances. In 1570, 5 tribes joined to form the most democratic nation of its time, the Haudenosaunee, or League of the Iroquois. They dealt with all matters common to all of the tribe. No tribe was allowed to make war by itself, and they passed laws to deal with crimes such as murder. The League was a strong power in the 1600s and the 1700s. It traded furs with the British and sided with them against the French in the War for Dominance of America between 1754 and 1763. The British might not have won that war without the support of the League. In the American Revolution, the League could not reach a unanimous decision on whom to support. As a result, everyone fought against the Iroquois, and they never recovered thereafter. In part to provide for the defense measures England was neglecting, the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven formed the New England Confederation in 1643. It was the European colonists' first attempt at regional unity. In 1675, Bacon's Rebellion, the first significant revolt against the royal authority, broke out in the colonies. The small farmers, embittered by low tobacco prices and hard living conditions, rallied around Nathaniel Bacon, a recent arrival from England. William Berkeley, Virginia's wealthy governor, refused to grant Bacon a commission to conduct Indian raids. Defying Berkeley's orders, Bacon led an attack against the friendly Occaneechi tribe, nearly wiping them out. Returning to Jamestown in September 1676, he burned it, forcing Berkeley to flee. Most of the state was under Bacon's control. It was, however, short-lived. He died the following month of fever. Berkeley re-established his authority and hanged 23 of Bacon's followers. In 1681, William Penn, a wealthy Quaker and a friend of Charles II, received a large tract of land west of the Delaware River to what became known to be as Pennsylvania. To help populate it, Penn actively recruited a host of religious dissenters: Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, Moravians, and Baptists. When Penn arrived the following year, there were already Dutch, Swedish, and English settlers living along the Delaware River. It was there that he founded Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Penn was motivated by a sense of equality not found in other American colonies at the time. Thus, women in Pennsylvania had rights long before they did in other parts of America. Penn and his deputies also paid considerable attention to paying the Delaware natives for any lands the Europeans settled on. Georgia was settled in 1732, the last of the 13 colonies to be established. The region was viewed as a buffer state against the Spanish incursion. The man charged with Georgia's fortification, General James Oglethorpe, was a reformer who deliberately set out to create a refuge where poor and former prisoners would be given new opportunities. Judges and prison authorities offered convicts a chance to migrate to colonies like Georgia instead of serving prison sentences. Few colonists, however, could finance the cost of the passage for themselves and their families to start a new life in the new land. I mean, how could they? Ships' captains received large rewards from the sale of service contracts for poor migrants, called indentured servants. And every method from extravagant promises to actual kidnapping was used to take on as many passengers as their vessels could carry. The expense of transportation and maintenance were paid by colonizing agencies as contract laborers, usually for 4 to 7 years. Free at the end of this term, they would be given freedom dues, sometimes including a small tract of land. It has been estimated that half of the settlers living in the colonies south of New England came to America under this system. Although most of them fulfilled their obligations faithfully, some ran away from their employers. Nevertheless, many of them were eventually able to secure land and set up homesteads, either in the colonies in which they had originally settled or in neighboring ones. No social stigma was attached to a family that had its beginning in America under this semi-bondage. Every colony had its share of leaders who were former indentured servants. There was one very important exception to this pattern: African slaves. The first blacks were brought to Virginia in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown. Initially, many were regarded as indentured servants who could earn their freedom. By the 1660s, however, as the demand for plantation labor in the southern colonies grew, the institution of slavery began to harden around them, and Africans were brought to America in shackles for a lifetime of involuntary servitude. Well, that's it for today. We're going to talk about colonial America in the next part. It's actually cool, you know, the colonial period. And by the way, you know what's cool? YouTube memberships. If you like what we're making and really want to help support us in our journey, we would really appreciate it if you could join 3-3 YouTube membership for as low as 99 cents or 29 rupees a month, a price of a cup of tea maybe. This will really help us in making more videos. All right, see you in the next video.